I did this watercolor on toned paper. And that's a technique that I use actually quite a bit with my illustration work, where I will use either gray or more typically uh, tan colored mixed media paper. And I'll do sometimes just straight watercolor, other times watercolor with a combination of gouache or casein to go along with it. And I think it's a technique that many watercolorists really fail to even realize is something that's uh, affordable for them. It's something that they can do and use. It's a technique that can really speed up the process. And I know I talk a lot. If you listen to my videos, I talk a lot about speed, but as a especially magazine illustrator, very often I'm required to do a painting a day every day for maybe several weeks at a time. And they can be very complex paintings with a lot of figures and a lot going on. So speed is of primary importance. But that doesn't mean that I, I get sloppy with it, that I sacrifice quality. That's not the point at all. It's just getting things done in as uh, simple and easy a means as possible. And one of the techniques that I employ is working on toned paper that's either toned from the manufacturer or one that I will tone myself. In this case, chances are I would have used acrylic, because unless you use, say, casein, which dries closed, in other words, it dries and then it's no longer permeable, that takes a few days, so you got to sort of plan ahead. If I've done that, then that's fine, but normally I'm painting everything immediately. So in this case, I would have painted some sort of acrylic base down, and then it's not going to lift or in any way mix with the colors that I put down subsequently. And what this does now, of course, you don't have your bright white of the paper to draw off of, but what you do have is whatever color you toned your paper, that is now going to insinuate itself into every color mixture that you put down. And that is a wonderful way of unifying a painting and giving it a feeling that, at least color wise, it all works well together, and you don't have as much of an issue of a section of the painting sort of going off in its own direction and being fugitive and not really making any sense. So in that sense, it's really, really good to work on a toned surface. You also can immediately set the mood of your painting. So if you've done it in a cool color or a warm color, if you've done it really dark or really light, there are lots of things, lots of directions you can go by toning your surface to begin with. You've automatically set the tone for the emotional impact that it might have. So for instance, if you're wanting to do something very uh, cold and misty, well, you probably wouldn't tone it bright pink. You'd probably tone it, light blue or green or something like that, or mauve. Now there are exceptions. If you know your color theory, your color wheel, then you know that there are colors that are, what's the word? Complementary colors. Well, if you've toned your canvas or your paper with a complementary color, then when you go back on top of it, then whatever you're doing, that complement will shine through and can give a vibrancy that and a vibration of color that you wouldn't otherwise have had. So none of this is written in stone. It's very much a thoughtful process in that if you want to go a certain direction with your colors, then you would use a complementary. If you were wanting to go a particular direction, then you would, if you're wanting to make everything sort of analogous, then obviously you wouldn't tone your canvas or your paper with a complementary color. But if you were wanting this vibrant vibration of color, then yeah, absolutely you could go with a complementary or a split complementary color and come up with some really interesting color combinations that you wouldn't otherwise be able to create. And you'd also be creating a mood that you wouldn't otherwise be able to create. So I do that a lot. I really like doing watercolors on toned paper. And historically, lots of artists in the past worked on tan, buff, gray papers because it did everything that I've already talked about. Now, the white that I'm using, probably it was gouache at the beginning, although I'm always careful of gouache. It shifts values tremendously, and I find that a bit annoying because I'm just not used to it, and I don't want to look at something and say, oh, well, I know I want it 4 values darker, so I'm going to put this down and it'll darken itself 4 values darker or 4 values lighter in a few minutes when it dries. Well, if you're used to it and you don't mind it, then okay, that's fine. But for me, not so much. I'd rather put it down and it be as close to what I want as possible. Now you then ask, well, why do you use gouache? Well, some of it is because I have it. I bought it for a specific purpose, and so I've got it, so I'm going to use it. But the other thing is that gouache has some of the most intense, vibrant colors of any of the mediums. It just has these beautiful, luscious colors that kind of hard to get with caseins and oils and everything. So I really like to use gouache when I can for that. Now, one way of tempering that tendency toward tremendous value shifts is to mix it either proportionally with watercolor or casein, and that'll sort of modify it a bit and make it where it doesn't shift quite so badly. So that's something you can do. But with all mediums, yeah, there's a positive and a negative, and no medium is going to do everything. There's always a trade-off, and you just got to decide and determine, well, what are you willing to live with? Some things are more opaque, some less so. Some dry faster, some slower. I mean, it's just all a trade-off, and you just have to determine what you want to use it with, or what you want to do with it, and which medium works the best for you. Now, I will tell you, colors will sometimes want to muddy up if you're working transparently and you're working on a toned surface, so that if you put down, say, an orange on top of a blue, then unless you really make that orange really strong, then the blue that's up under it will tone it down and can make it quite muddy. So just be aware that if you're working with toned surfaces and you're also working with transparent paints, that's going to influence your color mixtures. And as long as you're aware of it and using it to your advantage, then it's great and it all works fine. But if not, you can put down a color and go, wow, I want to get really intense and bright like I wanted it to. Well, it's because it's transparent and the color below it is shining through and making its presence known. I think I experienced that a little bit with the sky. I'm not sure, but it seems to me as I'm watching myself paint that I feel like there was a point at which I had put down the blue and it was a bit muddier than I had anticipated. And so that's where I had to come in and, modify it, put down a couple extra layers and make the color more intense than I otherwise would have. You'll also notice occasionally I'll take the butt end of the brush and scrub it around. I do that to break the colors up. I do that to mix the colors. I do that to add texture. I do it for a whole lot of reasons. It's just a tool. It's just a tool like any other. And Leonardo da Vinci said, when asked, what's your favorite or most important tool when painting, and he said, my fingers. So that ought to tell you something. One is that your hands itself, your fingers, you can move the paint around and do some great effects. But also, don't be afraid to do anything. Watercolor painters, I think, at least in my experience, tend to be a little more experimental than, say, oil painters. I see them use credit cards and bits of plastic that they lay over to let the paint sort of dry, and all these sort of crackly abstract patterns. So there's all sorts of fun things that watercolor painters will do that those of us who paint in oils need to be aware of and be willing to experiment with. I will also say, for lack of a better term, maybe those kind of like street painters, those funky New York Soho acrylic painters. Oh my gosh. And they're painting huge. They will use everything, squeegees and just all sorts of things to make a mark on a wall or a canvas. And I think that's really very cool. One, it frees you up to experiment and try new things and get maybe looser if you have a tendency to get a little tight, but also it will give you textures and effects that you just can't get with a brush. Brushes are of course wonderful, but there are things that you just can't do with a brush that you've got to have a palette knife, a squeegee, plastic wrap, all sorts of things that will make those textures, make those different marks that are just really unachievable any other way. So being willing to do just something as easy as flipping your brush over and using the back end to scribble the paint around can wind up being just a nice little arrow that you put in your quiver that you can pull out when you need to and hit the mark. So how's that for a sort of odd segue into an analogy? But yeah, I just wanted to point those things out, and I think that's about all I want to say on this one. You can finish watching. I'll put on some music, and I appreciate you listening. If you've enjoyed this episode of The Arthropologist, please hit the like button. And if you'd like to see more episodes like this, think about subscribing. I'm Bill Wilson, and I'm The Arthropologist.